There is a moment in every relationship that almost nobody notices when it happens. No argument, no dramatic ending, no clear betrayal, just silence. Not the peaceful silence of comfort, but a subtle emotional distance that slowly replaces warmth. Conversations become shorter, responses become delayed, contact fades, and the strange part is nothing looks wrong from the outside. But internally, something powerful has already begun. Because emotional withdrawal is not absence. It is communication. And in many cases, it is the most psychologically powerful message a human being can send without saying a single word. Most people believe attraction dies because of conflict. They think relationships collapse because of fights, incompatibility, or external problems. But psychological research and real relational dynamics show something far darker. Attraction often begins to change not when people move closer or fight harder, but when one person quietly steps back emotionally. Withdrawal creates uncertainty. Uncertainty activates attention, and attention awakens obsession. The human brain is not designed to ignore emotional loss. It is wired to chase emotional disappearance. This is where dark psychology begins, because emotional withdrawal is rarely random. Sometimes it is unconscious self-protection. Sometimes it is emotional exhaustion. And sometimes, whether intentional or not, it becomes a form of psychological power. When emotional availability decreases, perceived value increases. Not because the person becomes better, but because the brain interprets reduced access as potential loss. And loss triggers survival mechanisms. Deep inside the nervous system, attachment circuits activate. Dopamine pathways become unstable. Prediction systems fail. The mind begins asking a question it cannot tolerate. What changed? And once that question appears, emotional balance disappears. You see, attraction thrives on emotional certainty in the beginning, but long-term desire often awakens through emotional unpredictability. This paradox is uncomfortable but real. The more predictable emotional energy becomes, the less attention the brain gives it. But when emotional signals become inconsistent, the brain shifts into monitoring mode. Now every small action matters. Every message delay becomes meaningful. Every tone shift becomes analyzed. Every silence becomes loud. This is why emotional withdrawal feels so powerful. It forces psychological engagement without effort. But here is the darker truth most people never realize. Withdrawal does not only affect the person being distanced from, it changes the withdrawer too. Because when someone pulls back emotionally, they also begin detaching from their own emotional investment. The brain protects itself by reducing empathy, lowering vulnerability, and creating psychological distance. Slowly, emotional memory weakens. Connection becomes conceptual instead of felt. And once emotional feeling turns into observation, power shifts. In relationships, power rarely belongs to the person who loves more. It belongs to the person who needs less emotional reassurance in that moment. This is not cruelty. This is neuropsychology. The human brain unconsciously calculates emotional dependence. Whoever appears less emotionally affected becomes perceived as more stable, more valuable, more psychologically grounded, even if internally they are simply protecting themselves. and this perception alone reshapes attraction. Now something dangerous begins. The pursuing partner increases emotional effort. More messages, more explanations, more attempts to reconnect. But psychologically, increased pursuit often deepens withdrawal. Why? Because pressure amplifies emotional fatigue, and emotional fatigue strengthens distancing behavior. Without realizing it, both people enter a feedback loop. One moves closer, the other moves away. This is the push-pull dynamic in its rawest psychological form. But emotional withdrawal goes even deeper than relational behavior. It activates childhood attachment patterns. If someone experienced emotional inconsistency early in life, withdrawal does not feel new. It feels familiar. And familiarity, even painful familiarity, creates emotional magnetism. The brain confuses recognition with connection. So instead of walking away, many people lean in harder. They try to earn closeness. They try to restore emotional warmth. They try to solve a silence that was never meant to be solved logically. Because emotional withdrawal cannot be argued away. It must be understood psychologically. And here lies the darkest layer. Sometimes withdrawal increases attraction precisely because it removes emotional certainty. Certainty calms the nervous system, but uncertainty stimulates it. When emotional availability becomes unpredictable, dopamine spikes not from pleasure, but from anticipation. The brain begins craving emotional resolution. And craving feels dangerously similar to desire. This is why people often say they became more attracted after someone pulled away. Not because distance created love, but because distance activated psychological pursuit mechanisms. The mind starts replaying memories, searching for meaning, reevaluating value, idealizing what feels like it might disappear. Withdrawal turns presence into scarcity, and scarcity transforms perception. Suddenly flaws fade, importance grows, emotional focus narrows. The person who withdrew becomes psychologically larger inside the mind than they ever were during closeness. This is not romance. This is cognitive amplification, and once amplification begins, emotional balance disappears. The relationship stops being about connection. It becomes about regaining emotional equilibrium, and that is when emotional withdrawal becomes powerful enough to reshape identity itself. Because the person experiencing distance no longer asks, "Do I love them?" They begin asking, "Why am I losing them?" And that question changes everything. Emotional withdrawal does not hurt only because someone becomes distant. It hurts because the brain experiences distance as danger. Human attachment was never designed for emotional uncertainty. For thousands of years, emotional connection meant safety, belonging to a tribe, a partner, a secure bond. Losing emotional responsiveness once meant possible abandonment, and abandonment historically meant survival risk. So when emotional withdrawal appears in a modern relationship, the brain reacts using ancient survival systems. This reaction is automatic. The logical mind may say, maybe they're just busy, but the nervous system whispers something else. Connection is disappearing, and the body listens to the nervous system, not logic. Inside the brain, one of the first systems activated is the anterior cingulate cortex, the same region that processes physical pain. Studies show emotional rejection and physical injury activate overlapping neural pathways. This means emotional withdrawal is not metaphorically painful. It is neurologically painful. The brain cannot clearly distinguish between emotional loss and physical threat. Now dopamine enters the story, and this is where emotional withdrawal becomes dangerously powerful. Most people think dopamine is the chemical of pleasure. It is not. Dopamine is the chemical of pursuit. It rises strongest not when rewards are guaranteed, but when rewards become uncertain. Psychologists call this intermittent reinforcement. When affection becomes unpredictable, sometimes warm, sometimes distant, dopamine spikes higher than during consistent affection. The brain becomes alert, focused, obsessive, because uncertainty forces prediction, and prediction requires attention. This is why silence suddenly feels louder than conversation. The mind begins scanning memories. What did I say wrong? When did things change? Are they losing interest? Every unanswered question becomes an open psychological loop. And the human brain hates unfinished emotional loops, so it tries to close them by thinking more, checking more, reaching out more. But here lies the paradox. The more one person mentally pursues closure, the more emotional power shifts toward the one who withdrew. Not intentionally, but neurologically, because emotional investment equals cognitive occupation. Whoever occupies more mental space becomes psychologically dependent on resolution. And dependence quietly redistributes power. Meanwhile, the withdrawing person undergoes a different neurological process. Distance reduces emotional stimulation. Reduced stimulation lowers oxytocin bonding signals. Without constant emotional exchange, attachment intensity slowly fades. This creates emotional asymmetry. One nervous system becomes hyperactivated. The other becomes calmer. And calmness in relational psychology is often perceived as strength, even when it is simply disengagement. Now another mechanism activates, the Zeigarnik effect. The brain remembers unfinished emotional experiences more strongly than completed ones. When conversations end emotionally unresolved, when affection disappears without explanation, when closure never arrives, the mind refuses to let go. It keeps replaying the relationship like an unfinished story. This is why emotional withdrawal creates obsession far more effectively than rejection. Rejection gives clarity. Withdrawal gives ambiguity, and ambiguity keeps emotional attachment alive, because hope survives inside uncertainty. If someone clearly ends a connection, pain eventually stabilizes. But when someone slowly becomes emotionally unavailable without clear closure, the brain keeps searching for signals. Every small interaction becomes meaningful. A short reply feels hopeful. A delayed message feels catastrophic. Emotional perception becomes distorted, not because the person is weak, but because their nervous system is trapped in anticipation. Anticipation is addictive. Casinos use this principle. Social media uses this principle, and relationships unknowingly recreate it. Unpredictable emotional rewards create stronger attachment than consistent ones. This explains a painful truth many people struggle to accept. Sometimes emotional withdrawal increases attraction not by giving more, but by giving less at unpredictable intervals. The brain starts associating relief with reconnection. When warmth briefly returns, dopamine surges. The person feels intense emotional reward, and that reward strengthens attachment even more. This creates a psychological conditioning loop. Distance, anxiety, reconnection, relief, stronger attachment. Over time, the relationship stops being about connection itself. It becomes about escaping emotional discomfort. And once attachment becomes relief-based instead of connection-based, emotional dependency forms. Now something even darker begins. Identity involvement. The person experiencing withdrawal begins tying their self-worth to restoring emotional closeness. They don't just want the relationship back. They want emotional validation restored. Because withdrawal silently communicates a threatening message. You are no longer affecting me the same way. And humans fear emotional irrelevance more than rejection. Rejection still acknowledges importance. Indifference removes significance entirely. So the brain fights harder against indifference. This is why emotional withdrawal feels psychologically heavier than conflict. Conflict still contains engagement. Withdrawal removes emotional feedback completely. And without feedback, the brain fills gaps with imagination. Usually negative imagination. Now the relationship transforms internally. Instead of two people connecting, one person becomes emotionally reactive while the other becomes emotionally observational. This imbalance creates what psychologists call perceived power imbalance. And attraction begins reorganizing around that imbalance. But here is the hidden irony. The withdrawing person often does not feel powerful. They may feel tired, overwhelmed, emotionally flooded. Withdrawal is frequently self-protection, not manipulation. Yet psychologically, its effect remains powerful regardless of intention. Because the brain reacts to behavior, not motives. And silence is one of the strongest behavioral signals humans perceive. Silence forces interpretation. Interpretation creates meaning. Meaning creates emotional intensity. And emotional intensity fuels attachment. This is why distance sometimes creates obsession even when love itself has not increased. The brain is not chasing the person anymore. It is chasing emotional certainty. At a certain point, emotional withdrawal stops being only a reaction. It becomes a transformation, not outside but inside the psychological structure of the relationship. Because relationships are never sustained only by love. They are sustained by emotional exchange, attention exchanged, energy exchanged, validation exchanged. When that exchange suddenly slows or disappears, something subtle happens. The emotional equilibrium breaks. And the moment equilibrium breaks, the mind begins reorganizing hierarchy. This is the part most people never consciously notice, but they feel it. The one who waits begins to feel smaller. The one who withdraws begins to appear larger. Not because either person changed their value, but because attention started flowing only in one direction. Psychologically, attention equals investment. An investment quietly determines perceived importance. The person thinking more, checking more, analyzing more, unknowingly places the other person at the center of their mental world. Meanwhile, the withdrawing person gradually moves outward from emotional dependency. This creates an invisible emotional gravity shift. An attraction often follows gravity. Humans are drawn toward emotional stability. When one nervous system becomes anxious and the other becomes calm, the calm system appears grounded, even if that calmness is simply emotional disengagement. Here lies the uncomfortable truth. Emotional withdrawal often creates attraction not because distance is romantic, but because certainty disappears. Certainty relaxes the brain. Uncertainty activates it, and activated minds attach stronger. Now another deep mechanism begins: projection. When communication decreases, imagination increases. The mind fills silence with idealization. People begin remembering only emotional highs. They replay moments selectively. They rewrite memories unconsciously. The withdrawing person slowly becomes more mysterious, more emotionally significant, more psychologically large than reality. Mystery amplifies perceived value, because the unknown allows fantasy, and fantasy is emotionally stronger than facts. This is why emotional withdrawal sometimes makes someone seem more attractive than when they were fully available. Availability shows reality. Distance allows imagination, and imagination almost always exaggerates emotional importance. But something darker happens beneath this process. The person experiencing withdrawal starts negotiating internally. They lower emotional standards without realizing it. Behaviors once unacceptable begin to feel understandable. Silence becomes maybe they're stressed. Distance becomes maybe they need space. Inconsistency becomes maybe I should be more patient. The mind adapts in order to protect attachment, because losing emotional connection feels more threatening than adjusting expectations. This is how emotional imbalance slowly normalizes. And once imbalance feels normal, emotional power consolidates. Not through dominance, through emotional scarcity. Scarcity increases perceived value. This principle exists everywhere: economics, social dynamics, and relationships. What becomes rare becomes psychologically important. Emotional availability, once constant, now feels like a reward, and rewards strengthen attachment loops. Now we reach the deepest psychological layer: identity involvement. At this stage, the relationship stops being about connection alone. It becomes tied to self-worth. The person experiencing withdrawal begins asking unconscious questions. Why am I not enough anymore? What changed about me? How do I bring them back? Notice the shift. Focus moves away from understanding the relationship and toward repairing the self. This is where emotional withdrawal becomes dangerous, because attachment transforms into self-evaluation. Instead of two people navigating distance, one person begins fighting an internal battle for validation. And the more validation feels distant, the more emotionally valuable it becomes. This is why emotional withdrawal can create obsession even without intention. Not because someone is controlling, but because the human brain equates emotional responsiveness with personal significance. When responsiveness disappears, significance feels threatened, and humans will fight intensely to restore significance. But here is the paradox few people realize. Withdrawal also weakens attraction over time, even while increasing obsession. Obsession is not attraction. Obsession is anxiety searching for relief. Real attraction requires emotional safety, and prolonged uncertainty slowly exhausts the nervous system. Eventually, the brain stops chasing connection and starts protecting itself. This is when emotional numbness appears. The same withdrawal that once created longing begins creating detachment, because the psyche cannot survive endless unpredictability. So it adapts. It shuts down emotional sensitivity. And suddenly, both people become distant, not because love ended in one moment, but because emotional safety slowly disappeared. This is the hidden life cycle of emotional withdrawal. First confusion, then pursuit, then obsession, then exhaustion, then emotional disengagement. And by the time clarity arrives, both individuals often feel strangers to the connection they once shared. And this is the truth most people never understand about emotional withdrawal. Silence is never empty. It is filled with interpretation. Distance is never neutral. It reshapes attraction, power, and identity quietly, without arguments, without endings, without words. Sometimes people withdraw because they want control. Sometimes because they feel overwhelmed. And sometimes because they no longer know how to stay emotionally present. But regardless of intention, withdrawal changes the psychological landscape of a relationship. Because humans do not attach only to people. They attach to emotional responses. And when those responses disappear, the mind begins searching for meaning, even where none is given. So the real question is not, why did they withdraw? The real question is, what did the silence make you believe about yourself? Understanding that difference is where emotional freedom begins. Take a slow breath. Let this sink in. And if this deep psychological exploration helped you see relationships more clearly, make sure you subscribe to the channel, because here we don't just talk about relationships, we understand the mind behind them.